Hi, welcome to Chess 24/7, and you're encountering the second video on the topic of chess imbalances. And in this video I will be talking about the imbalance of minor pieces. So with that said, let's get started. The term minor piece means the bishops and the knights. And the imbalance of minor piece means the counterplay that exists between these pieces on the chessboard in a given position. Normally, a bishop and a knight are considered to be equal and are considered to be 3 points each. But in some positions, bishops might turn out to be better, or in some positions, knights turn out to be much better than the bishops. Well, it depends on the situation and on the position. And for the purpose of imbalances, Jeremy Silliman has provided us with some rules that I will be discussing with you one by one. So starting with the first rule is, as I stated, bishop and knights are both worth 3 points. However, it's up to you how you manipulate the position and make whatever piece you own more valuable. For example, in certain positions, knights might have better home than the bishop pair, and in some positions, bishops will act extremely better than the knights. We will be discussing each of the positive points about each piece. But now let's move on to the next point, which states that bishops are best in open position where pawns do not block their diagonals. In the following positions, white has a white bishop, although the scope of white bishop is completely closed for this game. Although black possesses a knight which is sitting on d4 and acting really beautifully right now. The black king can move down the road and can eat up the c2 pawn. Let's say the white king moves to c1, black goes to a1, gaining a position. The white king, let's say, go back to d2, because wherever this bishop will go, it will have no scope. The black bishop will come one step more closer, and now the pawn will fall on c2. Rule 3 states that bishops are very strong in endgames where both sides have passed pawns that are dashing to their respective queening squares. In such situations, the long-range capabilities of a bishop make it far superior to the slow short-range knight. For example, in this case, black is going to win this game because black has a dark square bishop on b2, which is having a close eye on the h8 square, which is the not home but from where all the pawns have to go from a1 to h8, or this whole diagonal is covered by the bishop, and all the pawns have to go through this diagonal once to get it to the queening square. Although black can easily advance its pawn on a3 to a1, and the knight on h1 cannot do anything to protect or avoid this queening of pawn because of the short range capability of the knight. Rule 4 says that the term bad bishop means that your bishop is situated on the same color as your center pawns, which block it and limit its activity. If you have such a bishop, you should usually try to trade it for a piece of equal value, or get the pawns of the color of your bishop, or try to get the bishop outside the pawn chain. For example, in the following position, the bishop on c4 is by definition a bad bishop, but because it is outside the pawn chain, it still has some scope and covers some diagonals and some squares. And if you look at the black's white bishop, which is on c6, it is a good bishop for black, but it's still inactive due to the presence of the pawns on the white squares. And let us say that if the bishop on c4 would have been on e2, then in that case it would be termed as completely bad, because it would not be outside the pawn chain and would be having very few squares to cover too. Rule 5 says a bishop's weakness is that it is stuck on one color for the whole game, and anything resting on the other color is safe from its attention. Although two bishops work together very well because you control both color diagonals, thereby negating this one color weakness. For example, in the following video, white is 2 pawns ahead, but he cannot win because he has a white bishop and the king is sitting on f6, which cannot be chased away by the white bishop. Although if white had a dark square bishop, he would still be having some scope to play in the game. Rule 6 says knight love close positions with lock pawns. Their ability to jump over other pieces make them very valuable in such situations. For example, the knight on c5 is much better than the bishop on f. The knight on c5 covers b3 and e5 pawns, although the bishop on b3 is locked down because the pawns are on white squares and are limiting its activity. Rule 7 says knight usually stands better in the center of the board. And there is a very famous chess adage that says a knight on the rim is dim. There are two reasons for this. The first is that a knight on the side rim must make several moves to reach an endgame area on the other wing. A knight in the middle can jump to either side at will. The other reason for this distrust of rim is that knight simply controls fewer squares. For example, in the following position, the knight on d6 is much more active than the knight on a2, and it's all because of the position of the knights. The knight on d6 covers more squares than the knight on a2. It covers all the following marked squares, while the knight on a2 covers only 3 squares. Thus, it's better to have a knight in the center of the board than keeping it on the rim. The next rule says that knights are superior to bishop in an endgame if all pawns are on one side of the board. This is because the bishop's long-range power no longer have meaning, while the knight's ability to go either color square means that there is no safe haven for the enemy king or pawns. For example, in the following position, the white bishop cannot come into contact with the black king, knight or pawns. In the meantime, the white pawn on e4 and on h3 are vulnerable with the attack by the king and the knight. Thus we can say that here knight is much better than the bishop. Rule 9 says since knights are not long range pieces, they need to have secure advanced homes to be effective. These homes are called support points. For example, in the following diagram, here the knight on c5 is much better than the bishop because here it is attacking b3 and e5 pawn and is sitting on a home square known as c5. The next rule is related to its previous rule. The previous rule said that the knights should be provided some good squares if we want them to play in their best form. But this rule says that the knights, if you want to beat a knight pair, you should deprive them of any advanced support points. Then they would be inactive and as a result inferior to bishops. The reverse, of course, is that if you possess knights, you must strive as hard as you can to create support points for them. For example, in the following position, the pawn structure is quite symmetrical. Nobody has advantage in space, although there is an imbalance in minor pieces. Black possesses its knight pair, while the white side possesses one knight and one dark bishop. And another aspect of white side is they're trying to gain control of the d5 square, while all the black pieces are trying passively to remove the control of d5 square from white side. And white will try to remove the knight on b6, or will try to remove some advanced squares or advanced supports where he can infiltrate in the white territory through a4 or c4. For this purpose, white will play pawn to b3 so that it divides the knight from coming to a4 and c4. So these were the points related to the minor pieces and the imbalances stated by Jeremy Silman. I will try to exemplify what I really want to say through this video, and I'll be showing you a game of mine which I played on figs in just a moment. So I was playing with white pieces and I opened with e4 and my opponent replied with e5. I referred my knight to f3 and going for the king's knight opening, my opponent played d6. I consider it to be a bit passive, although this opening has been developed by a grandmaster, so it would be having its advantages and disadvantages. It would be having its pros and cons, but that's a different matter. Let's not go over there. So coming back to the game, I played d4, and here my opponent played d5, and this is losing tempo because he could have played d5 on the first move only. So I took the pawn on e5, and here my opponent played bishop b4 check, and I played c4 because it's not only attacking the bishop on b4, but it is also gaining the control of d4 square. So bishop has to move, bishop move to c5, and now I took the pawn on d5, and here my opponent developed his bishop and pinning my knight on f3 to my queen. So I played queen d3, getting out of that pin. Here my opponent played knight to a6, developing his knight, but in a very passive way, because a knight on the rim is dim, although he can move his knight back to some good square, but at this stage it is doing nothing in the game. So I developed my other piece, bishop e2, and getting ready for castle. Here my opponent made a sacrifice. Bishop takes f2 check, king take f2, and here my opponent take the knight on f3, and I took the knight, and I took the bishop on f3 with the queen, and after that he played his knight to c5, and I played bishop b5 check, and obviously my opponent cannot play c6 because after that d takes c6, and after that after b takes c6, bishop takes c6, forking the king and the rook. So after bishop b5, my opponent played king to f8, and after that I played b4, and he played a6, and here I decided not to give away my bishop pair because the board is quite open, and we all know that bishop in the open board are better than the knight pair. So I retreated my bishop back to e2, knight went to a4, and bishop went to, and my knight went to d2. My opponent played f6, trying to undermine the center and trying to put pressure on the e5 pawn, which is a passed pawn by the way right now. So I declined that offer by playing e6. My opponent played g5. I played my bishop to a3 because now my bishop has a great diagonal towards the king, and h6 was played, and obviously my opponent did not see the threat of getting towards his king. So I played b5, discovered attack by the bishop on a3. Knight e7 was played, and then I took the pawn on a6, and my opponent took the pawn on a6, and after that I took the pawn on f6 check, king moved to e8, queen took h8 check, and here my opponent resigned because there's only one move available, knight to g8, and after that there are two kinds of checkmate available. I'll show you both of them. The first one is bishop to h5 checkmate, or the other mate is after knight comes to g8, queen takes d8 checkmate. And the reason I wanted to show you this game was because I wanted to show you how we could use the imbalance of minor piece in our game. I thought this would be helpful for you to understand how could we use the imbalances in our game, and we can try to undermine our opponent with these imbalances. So with that said, this is the end of this video, and I hope you found it interesting and found it constructive somewhere down the line. So with that said, this is the end of this video. I hope you liked it, and see you in my next video. Till then, good day.